All right, let's get into it. Today, we're talking about a generation that's kind of hiding in plain sight. They're not the loudest voice in the room, but they are quietly shaping, well, just about everything in our economy and our culture. We're going to get into the real story of Generation X. You know, you've probably heard them called the forgotten generation, right? We're like the middle child of history, stuck between these two giant generations. But is that really what's going on? Or is that label just masking a much, much more powerful reality?
So, just so we're all on the same page, who are we talking about here? We're looking at folks born roughly between 1965 and 1980. And yeah, they are literally sandwiched between the baby boomers and the millennials. But you know what? That spot in the middle, that's exactly what makes their story so interesting.
Because far from being forgotten, this generation is basically the definition of the sandwich generation. I mean, they're the quiet backbone holding up the whole structure of modern family and work life.
Just look at the squeeze they're in. This really paints a picture of the pressure they are under every single day. We're talking about caring for their aging parents while also supporting their own kids. They're managing bills for multiple households. They're holding a huge share of the management roles at work. And whenever there's an economic shock, guess who's the first line of defense for the whole family? Yep, them.
And this quote, this one really gets to the heart of it. It just perfectly captures that feeling, that paradox of feeling totally stretched thin financially, but at the same time, you're the person everyone else is counting on.
But here's the thing. All that responsibility, it translates into some serious and seriously overlooked economic power. Let's look at how this scales up because it becomes a global force.
Take a look at that number. $15 trillion. That is the kind of money we're talking about in annual global consumer spending, all driven by Gen X. They have quietly become the world's top spenders. And to put that $15 trillion into perspective, think about it this way. If Generation X were its own country, it would be the second largest consumer market on the entire planet, bigger than China. It's just massive. And inside that powerhouse, Gen X women are an especially powerful force. They influence somewhere between 70 and 80% of all consumer spending, and that's not just their own purchases. We're talking about their influence over the whole household's financial decision-making. You know, the World Economic Forum has a great way of putting it. They call Gen Xers the household's CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. They're the ones making the key calls on everything from the mortgage and the kids' education to what's for dinner and which doctor to see.
Okay, but this is where the story gets a little more complicated. Because despite all that incredible spending power, Gen X is also dealing with the biggest wealth gap inside its own generation of any cohort. It is truly a tale of two completely different financial realities. I mean, just look at the retirement savings. It is stark. The top quarter of Gen X earners, they've got an average of $250,000 saved up. Not bad. But the bottom quarter, just $35,000. That gap is huge, and it points to a potential retirement crisis down the road, one that could put a ton of strain on everybody else. And this table right here shows why just looking at the average is so misleading. The average net worth is nearly $1 million, but that's because a few super high earners are pulling that number way, way up. The median, the number right in the middle, is closer to $250,000. That gives you a much more realistic and frankly more anxious picture for the typical Gen Xer. And when you zoom out and look at the whole generational picture, the gap is even more obvious. Even now, in their peak earning years, Gen X holds just 26% of the nation's wealth. Compare that to the baby boomers, who are still holding over 50%. This has huge downstream effects on everything, from their ability to help their kids buy a house to what gets passed on to the next generation. So the big question is, why? How did this happen? Well, it wasn't an accident. Gen X basically walked into an economic perfect storm. They entered the workforce during major recessions and the dot-com bust. They were the first generation that had to rely almost entirely on 401ks instead of pensions. And on top of all that, they got slammed with skyrocketing student debt and healthcare costs. But their story isn't just about money and pressure. It's also about this unique and really critical role they play as a bridge between the past and the future. Think about it for a second. They are the last generation to remember life before the internet, the analog world. But they were also young enough to get fluent in and become central to building the digital world we all live in today. They can speak both languages, which makes them this incredibly important translator between worlds. And you see this bridge role playing out differently across the globe. Here in the US, there are a smaller but very high-earning group of managers who are really shaping office culture. But you go over to Southeast Asia, and they're a much bigger part of the population, forming the core of a booming middle class that's driving the whole region's economic growth.
So no, Gen X is not the forgotten generation. They are the quiet backbone of our economy, of our families. They are the bridge between analog and digital, between boomers and millennials. Right now, they are holding it all together. The only real question left is, what will their legacy be for tomorrow?